Hello, I'm Amy Zawi with the Jerusalem Connection Red Alert Report for Wednesday, May 15th. Let's review. Why is anti-Zionism the same as anti-Semitism? Last week we had the privilege of watching and celebrating with Israel, enjoying its 71st birthday as a modern state. I also had the privilege on May 3rd to attend the Christian-Israeli Solidarity Breakfast at the Israeli Embassy in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Ron Dermer was our gracious host, and Pastor Hagee was one of our guest speakers. And both gave an insightful and inspiring message, both indicating the alignment of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and a little history lesson on both. Pastor Hagee did not mince words. He equated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism 100% unequivocal. You cannot deny it, no matter how many people try to say that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Ambassador Dermer gave a quick history lesson, noting that Zionism is not a couple decades old, not even 71 years old, or even 100 years old, but in fact Bible-reading folks who also read history and study it carefully back to colonial times in America, including President Adams and President Abraham Lincoln, all recognize that Judea is indeed the homeland of the Jews. It should be restored, and they hoped that the Jews would get their homeland back as a modern state. Quakers and Puritans who fled the religious persecution in Europe, also in America through their writings, reflected upon careful reading of the Old Testament, and also recognized the fact that the land known as Judea or modern-day Israel, is indeed the rightful homeland of the Jews, and while always welcome in America, they all hoped that the Jews would someday receive a restoration of their land, a return of their land to their authority, and that includes being a modern state. The fact is that Israel is over 3,000 years old, and that Jewish people have had a presence there the entire time, albeit at various levels of population. But the very idea of saying that Israel or Jews are occupying these areas known as modern-day Israel, Judea or Samaria, is actually a misleading term. Occupying implies that somebody doesn't belong there and has no right to it, and somehow took it by force. Therefore, to deny Zion is to deny Jewishness. Therefore, it is anti-Semitic. The words we use to convey ideas will actually influence how we think about them, and they'll introduce bias, which is why I keep bringing up the term occupying as a dangerous term denoting a bias against Israel and their rightful restoration to the land. We also see CNN and other organizations in the news media repeatedly report in a biased way against Israel, not showing, for example, the 700 rockets in the last 2 weeks or so that were lobbed at Israeli civilian populations from the Gaza. The news reporting was very, very bent, sort of highlighting the fact that Israel had retaliatory strikes against targeted areas in Gaza, trying their best to limit collateral damage and civilian damage, although you never know that on these news reports. But the UN beats a drum, constantly calling Israel occupiers and constantly having its human rights section sanction Israel as if it's the only ill-doer in the Middle East, when in fact it is the only bastion of human rights for women, gays, LGBTQ community, and minorities in the Middle East. Short of a full history review of how and why Jews from Europe began to settle in what is known as the modern state of Israel as early as the 1800s, let's get back to today. We've got women in Congress screeching and tweeting about how Israel is an occupying force and making derogatory terms about Jews in general. You need to know the truth. The Arabs that identify as Palestinians do indeed suffer greatly in the Gaza Strip and some areas of Judea, but they do that suffering at the feet of their own leadership, Hamas in the Gaza and the PA elsewhere. But why then is this our concern as Christians or as just law-abiding citizens in the United States of America or maybe in Western Europe? Because anti-Semitism is not only boiling away in these areas of the Middle East, most recently manifested as 700 or so rockets from the Gaza into civilian populations, We also see that this ground of zero of hate has spawned across the world and into our university campuses, into our halls of Congress, into the conference rooms of the UN. Squads of universities and students are beating a drum with the news media waving on the flames of hate towards Israel and towards Jewish people. That brings me to my latest set of statistics. To date, more Jews have been killed worldwide in the last year and a half than since the Holocaust. As reported in May 1, Israeli researchers found that violent attacks against Jews spiked significantly in 2018, with the largest reported number of Jews killed in anti-Semitic acts in the decades since World War II. And this is causing an increasing sense of emergency among Jewish communities worldwide. Of course, these stats included the 11 worshipers at the Pittsburgh Tree of Life who passed, not only, and in addition to the people that were wounded, and of course the more recent event in San Diego. The Anti-Defamation League did an audit in 2018 of anti-Semitic or hate crimes in general in New York State and found those with anti-Semitic origins were up 170%. The Jerusalem Post noted that the New York City Police Department said there was an 82% of an uptick of anti-Semitic attacks or outlashes in New York City in the first 3 months of 2019. The spike is also dramatic in Western Europe, where Jews have faced a greater degree of threats. In Germany, there was a 70% increase of anti-Semitic violence in the last year. It is now clear that anti-Semitism is not limited to a far right or a far left or even the Islamic triangle. It is mainstream and is often accepted by a civil society. That's a quote from Moshe Kantor, president of the European Jewish Congress. In addition to the shooting attacks, there is assaults and vandalisms, and even events where, caught on tape, Jewish people walking in New York City and being spat upon and called horrible names and cussed at. This on the day of the Holocaust Memorial just last week. Again, there's the newspaper participation. We had a New York Times editorial that depicted a horrible anti-Semitic trope. And the Times apologized for it, but they knew better because the cartoonist who did that was known for recycling Nazi propaganda and the old anti-Semitism of the last century in a new form. Anti-Semitism has gradually entered the public discourse. It is in the halls of our universities, in the quads, in the clubs. It's on the streets of New York City and elsewhere, and nobody seems to mind. You could not get away with these kinds of attacks on any other ethnic, religious, or racial group of people, and it is somehow accepted. People even make excuses for it, saying that somehow Jews deserve it. We need to be looking out for the truth and being very careful that people who simply criticize a particular policy of Israel, that is certainly up for a legitimate debate. But you can't just be also allowing the hostility and the blanket statements that are against Jewish people worldwide, and also denying the essential right of Israel as a state to exist and protect herself. In the Congress here in the U.S., we need to watch specific members who are outspoken in their anti-Semitism, and I will call it that, even though they will hide behind the race card and the gender card and say that their political debate is being stifled because they are women or Muslim or African American. But they are not merely criticizing Israel. They are indeed towing a line that it should not exist, nor should the people of Israel or Jews, and this cannot be accepted. People cannot pull out their identity card as a defense for hate and really bad ideas, wrong information, and even lies. And the UN sanctions on Israel, well, this only fuels their fervor and their boldness in criticizing Israel and Jewish people. And it is such an odd thing when Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East that does offer protections for minorities, women, religious minorities, and lifestyle minorities. It is only in Israel, in the Middle East, that you can have an alternative lifestyle and still live your life without fear of persecution, violence, or even death. As well, over 500 women have been killed in Israeli murder terrorist attacks in the last year. This is clearly an anti-woman moment or point to think about, and yet not one feminist comes to their defense. Not Sarsour, who claims to be for women, although she defends no women in the neighboring countries of Israel, whereas Hillary Clinton, Gloria Steinem. These women were killed for no other reason than their identity. They are not policymakers, and this was not a legitimate debate about policies. And what does all this hate and this weak justifications and the back-turning that we don't recognize anti-Semitism for what it is, what is the real danger? Well, not only is it unjust and unfair, and it is our responsibility as free-thinking, truth-thinking adults, it is our responsibility as Christians, or those, and even if you're not a Christian, but those of us who just want to, well, those of you who just want to find the truth, to protect people, that lies cannot be perpetrated and a group of people cannot be targeted just because of their identity, and it cannot be accepted by the culture at large. The Christians are the next group of people to be targeted by this same kind of hate. And then after that, the free-thinking people in general who may not align with any religion. We need to be watching out for those in power, and that power can be a political power, it can be a media power, it can be an educational power, but we have to keep these organizations in check. And when they espouse lies and hate, that it is not brushed over and ignored, and that the victims of it are actually recognized and something done to remedy it. This is indeed true for the college campuses as well as the Jewish people worldwide in communities around the world and those who reside in Israel. A lot to think about, and I have more next week to share with you. Shavua Tov, and have a great week.